fantastic. I'm
Yeah.
actually in Sevilla right now.
I've never been in Spain. I've never been to Spain. I'd love to go.
Oh, it seems like the kind of place you might enjoy
Oh,
for a
I'm
lot of
sure it would.
reasons.
I'm sure it would. I read
Well,
all.
most of the reasons I'm in Spain.
Sorry,
Sorry, go ahead.
you're going to say
Oh,
something. You're going to.
I was going to say most of the reason that I've been in Spain has been for history, and there's been just too many things that have been contemporary news. So I felt like I wanted to bring in someone that I respected to do some news questions.
Oh, that's nice.
Well, you're one of the few, so I'm glad you're able to answer some of these crazy questions. So I guess you said you looked over some of the things I was asking.
I read them. I read them all carefully, and I made a few notes. But don't worry, I've got it all in my head. I haven't got any papers whistling around. So
That's fine. All right, cool. Well, let me introduce you then. I guess like
Mm.
you're Alexander. Do you want to talk a bit about who you are?
Yes, I should say I'm lived in Britain since 1968. I was born in Greece, and I'm a Greek citizen. I come from a political family in Greece, a well-known political family. My great grandfather was mayor of Athens for something like 25 years. My father was a diplomat. My grandfather was a government minister, defense minister. My aunt was Minister of Culture in the 1980s, and a well-known film actress, but also, as I said, highly political person. I studied history at university, and I got allegedly, wasn't absolutely confirmed, but I allegedly got the highest mark at the University of London in modern history when I graduated. And then I had a legal career for many years, and for a time I was duty solicitor at the Royal Courts of Justice. And then, as I said, I fell ill and things went askew. And then I re-emerged and I started to do media work when I got to know a couple of people, including Alex Christoforou at the Duran.
Right. Okay. So then, what led you to get interested in that side of politics, let's say, or that side of democracy?
Well, as I said, I've always been involved in politics in a kind of way. I mean, I used to write some of my aunt's speeches, and I mean, I was sort of always interested in the sort of political side of things. And I did an awful lot of history, modern history, and I mean, that's ultimately, I think, more my subject than anything else. And when you do history the way I do history, which is study history, it makes you think a lot about politics and international affairs. And that's how I got drawn into it. So I used to write things. I did a blog when I wrote about contemporary political matters for a short time. That blog attracted some attention. I was then asked to appear on a couple of radio and TV shows, answered questions about various subjects, and one thing led on to the other, and here I am now doing it as a full-time job.
Well, that's fantastic. So, I mean, a couple questions, I guess, really quickly. On your spectrum of politics, do you have a place that you would consider yourself rigidly in, or are you more broadly?
Yeah.
What do you think of yourself?
I used to be. I mean, what I used to think of myself as. I mean, you know, I'm in my late 50s, so I sort of remember a world that's probably now gone. But I used to think of myself, and my point of origin is what I would call European social democracy. This is the social democracy of people like Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt in Germany, of Tage Erlander in Sweden, of Harold Wilson and James Callaghan in Britain. That kind of politics, in my opinion, is dead. I think we have left it so far behind that it doesn't really exist anymore. And I don't really consider myself as being in any way precisely on a left-right split, because I don't think these things have much meaning any longer. But to the extent that I have a sort of political orientation, I would say that originally it came from what you might call the centre-left. And I would still consider myself to be centre-left, but of a centre-left very different from the kind of centre-left you see today in places like the United States or indeed in Britain. I mean, a more, shall we say, blue type of left, as we say in Britain, one that's more emphasizing economics and social policies than some of the identity issues that have become so prevalent nowadays, and which is completely hostile to regime change wars and ideas of democracy promotion and all of that, which were also very opposed by the old left, of which I was a member.
I think that was exquisitely succinct.
Mhm.
So what is it about the Duran that you think brought you into it? We'll maybe mention a bit about the other Alex. I mean, there's the two
Yeah,
Alexes, you know?
yeah. I mean, this is the thing. I mean, we both met by chance in Moscow. We were introduced to each other by a mutual friend, as he then was. He's not a friend anymore, but that's another story. And we're both obviously Greek. Oh, he's Greek Cypriot and I'm Greek, and that's actually a different citizenship, but it's the same nationality. And Alex and I were both interested in Greek politics, and this is in 2015, which is the time of the Syriza crisis in Greece, where Syriza had led a lot of people in Greece up the garden path by appearing to oppose the bailout conditions that were being imposed on Greece during the financial crisis by the EU. And we both got to talking about things. Alex, I think it's fair to say, is centre-right. I, as I said, historically, am centre-left. But we discovered that we essentially agreed about the whole economic and political analysis about the situation in Greece. We both agreed that the politicians had failed Greece. We both felt that Tsipras was somebody who had completely betrayed his supporters in Greece and who, as I said, led Greece up the garden path. As a result, we became friends, and one thing grew to another. And about a year later, we agreed with a number of other people to set up the Duran. And eventually, as things have progressed, the Duran, I don't think this is unreasonable to say, has become increasingly him and me talking to each other, though Peter Lavelle is also, an important presence.
It's one of my favorite. It's one of my favorite news sources immediately, and it has been for at least a couple of years. So I guess this wasn't part of our original itinerary, but would you like to talk a bit about Greece and about what's happened to Greece in the last decade?
It's a painful subject for me because obviously it is my own country, and there was a period of time when it seemed that things in Greece were going quite well. I mean, the economy seemed to be growing, people seemed to be getting more prosperous, businesses appeared to be set up and succeeding, and living standards in Greece, which when I was born was very much a third world country, seemed to be improving. Also, of course, bear in mind that when I was in Greece, it was a time of great political crisis. I remember a time of dictatorship in Greece. There was a coup when I was 6 years old in Greece. My parents had to flee abroad. I was held hostage. That was when I was 6 years old by the Greek military government at the time in order to sort of keep them, to keep them under some kind of check. To prevent my parents speaking out about the situation. The Swiss Red Cross got me out and brought me to Britain, where I've remained ever since. But all these sort of nightmares about Greece seem to have been resolved. And it turned out, and this is really sad, that a lot of this was an economic bubble that having joined the European Union and then joined the Eurozone, Greece was borrowing far beyond its means. People within Greece were borrowing far beyond their means. The creative and productive sides of the economy were not being developed. And in fact, what we basically saw was speculation and heightened corruption. And then, of course, that bubble burst spectacularly, and Greece was saddled with massive debts. And at that point, it was obvious to people like me in Greece and a lot of other people in Greece that there needed to be a radical change of direction in Greece. And that had to mean, it seemed to me, Greece engaging in a restructuring on its debts, because there was no way it could pay them. And that also meant leaving the Eurozone, because the Eurozone was keeping Greece uncompetitive and was encouraging people to engage in this borrowing spree on the basis of a hard currency, which Greece really couldn't possibly manage. And what instead happened was that the European Union and the Greek government and the Greek political establishment and the Greek business community instead colluded in keeping Greece in the Eurozone and not going through with a debt restructuring and not really carrying out the reforms. So in fact, instead of those real changes that needed to be happening in Greece, the entire burden was being shifted down on Greek people, including Greek business people who were the true wealth creators of the country, and the economy just went into a tailspin. And then in 2014-15, Mr. Tsipras and Syriza came along, and they seemed to be saying a lot of correct things about the need for reform and the need for ending the oligarchical system that had existed in Greece, where Greece had been run by political families, including my own, by the way, for a very long time. And I thought, like many people, that this was a chance for a change, though I always had misgivings about it because I was never sure that Tsipras was really going to follow through. And in the event, what happened was that instead of Tsipras following through, he eventually capitulated, called a referendum. After calling a referendum in which the Greek people seemed to support the line he was taking, he went to Brussels, agreed to everything the European Union demanded, saddled Greece with even more unaffordable debt, committed Greece to repaying this debt at par in over a century, which it never will be paid, and pushed the economy even further down. And as for the reforms that I wanted to see, those never happened. And we now see in Greece the old firm, that's to say the New Democracy Party, the party of the old corrupt establishment, now back in power, as much in control as ever. So I feel very bitter and sorry about what happened. And I feel that obviously the European Union has played a big role in it. Obviously, the Greek establishment has played a huge role in it, but Tsipras himself, in the end, betrayed the hopes of the Greek people.
Do you think that this surmounts to a sort of almost neo-colonialism of controlling Greece for 100 years or more? And is this a common problem in Europe or around the world?
Well, in my opinion, it's exactly what you've said sums it up exactly. I mean, Greece no longer is in control of its own economic and political course, and if it abides by the terms of these bailout agreements in any foreseeable future, it cannot be, because the entire structure of Greece's government now is basically constructed around paying off debt, and it's not paying off debt in a way that is affordable and which is viable for the Greek people. It is paying off debt in ways which will deepen our dependency, because we're obliged to privatize. And privatization is not always a bad thing, but the way this is being done is essentially giving people from Europe preferential rights to Greek assets, which they're able to buy at knockdown prices and sort of bleed to their own advantage. I'll give you an example of that, by the way. I mean, Greece's Athens airport is now controlled by a German company, which charges very high prices for airlines to go to use, which is why you can't really buy cheap flights to Athens. I mean, a country that depends on tourism can't attract budget travelers to the airport of its own capital, because that is now impossible. So we have a situation of permanent vassalage in Greece, and that is true not just of Greece, it's true of an increasing number of countries. We saw the same happen in Italy, where the previous government of Silvio Berlusconi was opposed to some of the measures that the European Union was trying to impose on it, and it suffered many of the same financial problems orchestrated through the European Central Bank, and eventually Berlusconi's government was removed and a technical government was imposed on Italy, which carried out the EU formula that has also kept Italy in a state of permanent stagnation, which has been going on now for over a decade. And you've seen similar policies in lots of other places, in Spain, where you now are, in Portugal, in all sorts of places. There's been a momentary recovery, largely because of the recovery that's been orchestrated in the United States by the Federal Reserve Board, which has lifted the European economy also to some extent, and because Mario Draghi, the president of the European Central Bank, has been buying up bonds, government bonds of the peripheral states, like there's no tomorrow, which he's not legally, by the way, permitted to do, but never mind, he's been doing it. But this is not really a solution. And in the meantime, as I said previously, the governments of these countries are no longer real governments in any true sense. They are simply transmission belts to carry out the orders they're getting from Frankfurt, Berlin, Brussels, and Paris.
So do you think then, one thing I wanted to say, because there's also some questions that were being asked live, is the difference you mentioned between a state and a nation, because there are separate states that have the same nation in them. Could you, explain that a bit?
Well, there is a nation state, which is, of course, the nation which supposedly exercises power in that state, which is the state, through as happens in the United States or Britain or wherever, through elections, where the nation is able to hold the government of that state to account, and to some extent, at least in theory, oblige that state to carry out policies which are in the interests of the nation. Now, that nation may be constituted in many ways. I mean, it could be a mono-ethnic one, it could be a monolingual one, or it could be a nation made up, as it is in France or Italy, for example, of many disparate ethnicities and languages. I mean, Italy, for example, though there is definitely, I'd say, an Italian nation. The Italian nation brings together people of northern Italy, people of Sicily, people of all sorts of places, who are not, by the way, able, in their own languages to speak directly to each other. There is an official Italian, but that's very different from the language that is spoken in Venice or in Sicily. But nonetheless, there is there a nation. But then you have other states which no longer are responsive to their nations, the nations they govern, but which are, as I said, transition belts, because their bureaucracies and their governments are subordinate or exist to carry out not the wishes of the nation, however imperfectly, but of some, overarching institution. That might be a corporate institution based in another country, or it might, like the Panama, the sort of the United Fruit, which used to run governments in Central America, or it might be straightforward colonial governments, institutions like, the British used to run in many places, where they had governments in places like Egypt or Iraq or indeed Iran, but where it was always known it was the British who ran things. Or it might be the kind of system we now have increasingly in parts of the European Union, where governments like those of Greece no longer carry out the wishes of the Greek people. They carry out the wishes of, as I said, of the EU and of the EU establishment, and the institutions of the state are subordinated to that function rather than to serving the function of the nation state. We must be very careful to distinguish state institutions from national ones. They are not the same, even though they often are, but they are not necessarily the same. And increasingly we see within the European Union that they're not the same anymore.
So, what would you say for people that are trying? Okay, let's say, how do you feel about the contemporary mainstream media and what quality it's in and what consequences it's having on the audience and the listener? And what would you say are a good way for interested parties to learn more about the international world stage?
Well, this goes directly to why people like us, both of us, do what we do, because it seems to me quite clear that whereas 30, 40, 50 years ago, in countries like the United States, in Britain, in France, in Germany, in Italy, the media was a part of the national conversation. So you had a media which was responsive to the nation, and that it functioned within, and reflected the diverse views of that nation, and was there to keep the nation informed of what was going on, which is, to be clear, an essential part of democracy. You cannot have democracy if the nation is not properly informed of what is happening. What we are seeing increasingly, and not just in Europe, but unfortunately in many countries now, is that the media is becoming increasingly dissociated from this function and is beginning increasingly to serve the interests of the sort of overarching entities which I was talking about, which are no longer directly connected to the nation, but which are imposing, if you like, their ideas and their policies on the nations in the states where it functions. And this means that the media is no longer a reflection of news as I have previously understood it. Now, I want to make it very clear that that doesn't mean that, the media shouldn't express opinions. Everybody is entitled to opinions. But I do believe that the media has to report facts if it is going to carry out its proper function. There is a newspaper in Britain called The Guardian, which actually says that facts should be sacred. Facts are no longer treated by the media as sacred. They are becoming malleable. They're being manipulated, because that is essential if nations, through democratic processes, it is essential if nations are being prevented through democratic processes from holding the states to account. And as democracy is withering, we see the media withering also, and it is becoming increasingly a function of corporate interests. I can give so many examples of this. The one that I think Americans might be most interested in my opinion, is the utterly distorted way in which the whole Russiagate thing has been handled in the United States. Now, I know there are lots of views about Donald Trump, and I'm not here to defend Donald Trump, but what I will say is that Russiagate, as it was being reported in the media, was not true. And it never was true. And anybody who followed it could see it was not true. We should not have needed 3 years of massive investigation by people like Robert Mueller to tell us that there was no collusion there. I mean, it was obvious that there was no collusion there. And the extraordinary thing was how the media went on year in, year out, week in, week out, pretending otherwise. And no diversity of opinion about this was expressed or could be allowed to be expressed. And what has happened is that as the media, the mainstream media, the established media, the media that has always existed, the big newspapers, the big television stations, have failed to perform that essential function. We have seen through the internet agencies like ours, the Duran, like yours, we've come forward and we filled that space which they have vacated, and they don't like it, and that's why they criticize us in the way they do.
Okay, so this is maybe off topic, but maybe not. So why is it called the Duran? Is another question.
Why is it called the Duran? You know, it's a very good question. I'm not entirely sure. What I've heard is that it was an idea that came to Alex, and Alex is the person who really knows the answer to this question, on a trip, you know, possibly listening to the radio or something. What I do know is that I believe it is based on a Latin word, a Latin root, and it's the same root as you see in words like durable, for example. The idea is that it's hard and it has integrity behind it, and that's where it comes from. But as I said, Alex Christoforou is better at answering that question than me. He came up with the name, and I've gone along with it because, to be honest, I like it because it's different. I mean, it's completely distinctive. It's not like any other name of any other news agency. And of course, it provokes the very kind of question you've asked. And I think that intrigues people.
I think you answered that fine. I like that exactly. That's durable.
Durable. Yeah.
So okay. So in terms of international relations, what's the thing that the whole world should keep their mind on right now?
Well, I think the overarching story in international relations is that we're moving from a unipolar world, which is the one that we had briefly in the 1990s, towards what I would say is basically, again, a bipolar world. Very different from the one that existed, by the way, during the Cold War, which is an ideological conflict between two systems. This is a geopolitical conflict in which the battle is being fought out not so much in a battle of ideologies, but it's a battle, I think, of economics. And that is a very different kind of adversarial relationship. But we see on the one hand, the United States and its allies in the West. And I am someone who believes that the United States will certainly remain, for the foreseeable future, a major economic political pole. I take all of these arguments about American decline that you see in all sorts of places, I take them with great skepticism. I think the United States will remain a force to be reckoned with, certainly for the rest of my lifetime. But you also see a countervailing force beginning to emerge in what you might call Greater Eurasia, centered obviously on China, bringing now, however, increasingly Russia into the picture. And that is now an economic and political counterbalance to the United States. Now, what we are going through at the moment is a period of transition. Whilst this new bipolar reality is being negotiated, the United States, which briefly experienced the unipolar moment, finds it difficult to accept that it is passing, and it is struggling to come to terms with that fact. But eventually, I predict it will do so. And in perhaps 5 or 10 years, we will see a modus vivendi between these two blocs starting to emerge. I think it will be an adversarial relationship, but I think it will be a managed one, and a more successfully managed one in the end than that was during the Cold War. Because, as I said, it's not an ideological conflict this time.
So where does that leave Europe's agenda? And earlier you were mentioning the Russian hate. So I mean, with Russia's tremendously underpopulated, giant piece of land that they're trying to do, where is Russia's agenda, and how does it synchronize with this world stage?
Yeah, I think that the Russians, after they exited the period of enormous chaos that followed the breakup of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, I think what they initially wanted to do was to basically join up with the West, but at the same time keep some kind of distance from it. I think that they still felt deep down that they were or should be a great power, and that they did not want to be in a subordinated position to the US. And I think that when it became increasingly clear to them that that was not viable, and I think the key moment for that was a speech which Vladimir Putin, gave at the Munich Security Conference in 2007. I think even then, for a time, they thought that they could play a game of equidistance between the US and China. There's a story which I believe is true, because I've actually seen it said by a very important Russian minister, or former minister, a man called Shuvalov, who was for a time in charge of Russia's economy. He said that Joe Biden came to Russia in 2011 and met with Putin and said to Putin, well, you know, Russia can't lead. It's not in a position to lead the world. And Putin snapped back, that's absolutely right. Russia can't lead the world, but it can decide who will. And I think that was a key moment when the Russians were still trying to keep some kind of balance between the US and China. I think the effect of Russiagate and the effect of the Ukrainian crisis of 2014 is that it's just, you know, it's decided the Russians that they really have no option, if they're to preserve any kind of freedom of maneuver, but to commit wholeheartedly to a close relationship with China. But I think that nonetheless, because it's a big country, underpopulated, as you say, but it's still a big country, it will nonetheless try to retain a foreign policy that will not be totally subordinated to China. So we'll see a sort of relationship, a very close relationship between the Chinese and the Russians, an alliance, if you will, but it will not be an alliance of, you know, a hegemon and a vassal. It will be an alliance between a stronger power and a weaker power, but one in which the weaker power nonetheless retains some degree of freedom of action. I think the Europeans need to make a very careful decisions about what they're doing. Firstly, I think that Western Europe, countries like Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, they will still have ultimately to maintain a very close relationship with the United States, and they will still need to be, I think, part of a US system. But they also have to reckon with the fact that they have the Russians and the Chinese sharing the same land mass as the one that they are on. And I think what they need to do is to understand that this relationship with what I call the Eurasian powers, Russia and China, needs to be managed carefully, and that their job is to ensure that that it is managed carefully with the US. So they need to keep the bridges open to Moscow and Beijing, and they need to keep the United States aware of that fact and to help it by providing that bridge. That's not what has been happening up to now. What we have seen instead is the Europeans very, very tamely agreeing to everything, even the most extreme positions that the United States is taking. And that is not in Europe's interests, and is not, I think, ultimately in America's interests, because America also needs to move towards an accommodation with the fact that, as I said, we've gone from a unipolar moment to a bipolar one, and it needs the Europeans to help it understand that.
How do you feel that Britain, do you think Britain is kind of in a similar circumstance, or what is the climate of British politics right now around Brexit and association with the other countries?
Well, Britain has all these problems that we've been talking about, but taken to an extreme, because of course what has happened in Britain is that since the 1980s, the political situation in Britain has changed to the point that we now have a political establishment and a political elite that has identified itself wholeheartedly with the project, the unipolar project that existed in the 1990s, with, you know, the center being Washington, but with the European Union being absolutely part of that structure. And a population, a British population, which doesn't feel like that at all, which wants Britain to start pursuing policies that are in the interests of British people. And if we look at the situation in Britain, the situation here in Britain is not good. I mean, we've have many of the same problems that you see in the United States. We have problems with student debt, which are very concerning for British students, just as they are for American students. We see problems of declining healthcare. We see growing problems of extreme inequality. We see a financial system which is completely out of control as it has become globalized and is no longer serving the interests of the British economy. And we see very widespread deindustrialization in many of the British regions. And so you see growing dissatisfaction amongst the British population about all of these things, growing unwillingness on the part of the elite, which is benefiting from these things, to accept that those concerns that are being expressed by that population have any legitimacy behind them. And so we see a sort of conflict emerging, and that conflict has crystallized around the issue of Brexit. Now, I was traveling around England, which is the core territory of the United Kingdom of Great Britain. England, let me say, I mean, I've been accused sometimes of discounting the importance of Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales. But one mustn't forget that England accounts for 80% of Britain's population. Without England, the United Kingdom is simply not viable. And I've been traveling around England, and what I've noticed, and for the first time, is that people around England are talking about Brexit all the time, and they are flying instead of British flags. You see this outside houses, you see campsites, you see this with young people, you see with old people. They're flying the flag of England as opposed to Britain. So they are, in a sense, asserting their national identity against the British elite in London and against the European elite in Brussels, and ultimately against the neoliberal elite everywhere. And that is an important and essential change. Now, what I think Britain needs to do is it needs to get Brexit done. I think it would be incredibly dangerous if we didn't have Brexit. I think if we don't have Brexit, this division that I'm talking about is going to grow to extremely dangerous dimensions. And we could start to see really dangerous political movements starting to develop in England. We have not seen that so far. I know there have been attempts to try and paint Jeremy Corbyn or Nigel Farage somehow threats to democracy. That isn't true at all, in my opinion. But if what people are voting for in England doesn't happen, then, as I said, we could start to see a much more dangerous situation starting to develop over the medium term. And then, having achieved Brexit, we need to take a very hard look both at the internal situation in Britain and start to restructure our economic and social policies to reflect the interests of the British nation, which we have not been doing up to now, and also our foreign policy also. A foreign policy that is a real foreign policy, not just one that does whatever Washington says and which sees everything basically through the framework of Brussels. Now, Britain has pursued, notable foreign policies in the past. It's not so long since it was an important power. I think it has the skill sets to do that again, but it does need a radical reformation at the center of power in London, and that is being resisted at the moment.
So how does the UN affect the EU and the world stage? Is it affecting Europe?
The United Nations?
Yes. Is there any sort of effect you see of the collection of these larger powers through the UN?
Yes. Well, the UN is two different things. Firstly, there are its two major institutions, the Security Council and the General Assembly, which are both gatherings of nation states. And in my opinion, those serve very useful functions because they allow nation states and the great powers to talk to each other and to conduct diplomacy with each other. North Korea and the United States, for example, because they don't have diplomatic relations, when they needed to talk to each other, they did so in New York through these institutions of the United Nations. And I think that still serves an important function. At the same time, alongside these two important diplomatic vehicles, you have the various bureaucracies that have evolved within the United Nations. Now, I know there is a fear among some people that these bureaucracies are somehow overarching bureaucracies and the United Nations is out to create itself as a world state. I mean, I've never thought that had any reality behind it. But what concerns me much more about the UN bureaucracy is that what happened during the unipolar moment of the 90s, the 1990s and early 2000s, is that the UN bureaucracy became captured to a dangerous extent by not so much the United States, but by the political elite which controls the United States. So you see that these UN bureaucracies have become, to a very alarming extent, an echo chamber for the US State Department. And the result is that where formerly, during the Cold War, they used to have an important mediating role. So, you know, somebody, a UN General Secretary in the sort of 60s, someone like, you know, Doug Hammarskjöld or Utant, would come along to Moscow and Washington, wherever, and well, not Beijing, but, well, in the 1970s, Beijing, and would be able to talk as a neutral person to these various countries. What we now see is that the UN bureaucracy has become increasingly a mechanism for legitimizing whatever the US at any particular point in time is trying to do. So we see UN agencies basically saying, for example, that the US is absolutely right in all its criticisms that it's making of what is happening in Syria and or Venezuela or other places. Whereas once upon a time, it had, as I said, a different role. We see this also with organizations like the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which has increasingly come to reflect what is often called the Washington Consensus, which, to be clear, is the sort of global unipolar consensus, as opposed to reflecting the sort of diversity of views around the world and trying to mediate between those views. And I think that is a dangerous thing. I don't think one should exaggerate the importance of the bureaucracies of the UN. They are more, in my opinion, an embarrassment and an inconvenience. And as I said, I suspect we move towards a greater multipolar world, a bipolar world. We will see these agencies adapt and change over time. But you know, that will take time. And at the moment, I mean, they're obviously under Washington's thumb.
What do you think about the U.S. political spectrum and how it's perceived by the world and around Europe, and how does that matter or affect the U.S. or the other world states?
Well, if you live outside the United States, the great power of the United States means that anything that happens in Washington or in the political system in the United States immediately has bearing upon you. It's something every country has to take into account. It does matter very much what happens in Washington, how the political situation evolves there, because the United States remains the world's most powerful country and will, I think, continue to for a while yet, and will always remain, as I said, for the foreseeable future, a force to be reckoned with. And so the political situation in the United States matters. And the concern is that it has become increasingly and disastrously dysfunctional. We see an elected president who has been subjected to what I think is a ridiculous, indeed preposterous conspiracy theory, which came very close to delegitimizing him and which still causes damage. We see a conflict but within the the constitutional system, so that the American government no longer seems to function properly anymore. And we see institutions like the State Department, the CIA, the FBI, the Pentagon, which no longer seem to be any longer properly under control. And we also see around the world an incredible partisan conflict playing out in the United States, which is very difficult to understand for outsiders, and which is very alarming to outsiders. And what that is doing is it's doing a number of things. Firstly, it's creating doubts about the stability of policy within the United States and the rationality with which policy is being decided there. And that is at the same time lowering the prestige of the United States and is heightening concern about the United States. So that is having an impact even amongst countries which historically have been America's friends, Britain being a case in point. At this moment in time, in Britain, popular feeling about the United States in Britain is becoming increasingly negative. And if you go to Germany, which is another country which historically has been very close to the United States, you see that taken even further there. Hello, I think I've lost you. I can't hear you. I can't hear you. Hello? Hello? I can't hear you.
1 second. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Yes, yes.
Sorry, I'm trying to adjust the sound. I think it got muted. Okay, so then if you're thinking that there's places for these international communications and dialogues, does that legitimize at all some sort of a place for the Trilateral Commission, Council for Relations, the Bilderberg Group even? Is there some place that makes sense then?
If you're talking about international relations, I think international relations is far better conducted between foreign ministers and ambassadors, not through these shadowy bodies, which, to be frank, I don't think have a mediating role. I think they have an imposing role. I think they're very much part of the Washington consensus. And I don't want to sound conspiratorial now, but I think sometimes they do operate in a semi-conspiratorial way. The people who make them up obviously would deny that. But if you see what the kind of things that they come up with, they are always coming up with the same sort of ideas which seek to legitimize the Washington consensus and delegitimize everything else. I have to say there will always be situations where powerful people come together and share views and engage in these sort of things. I mean, again, it's not paranoid to say this. Powerful people meet and they engage in conspiracies from time to time. Sometimes these are malign conspiracies. Sometimes these are very open conspiracies. Sometimes they agree with each other and they use that agreement to try and impose their opinions on everybody. That has always happened throughout history. But we certainly mustn't see these bodies as mediating bodies, because they are not. Even Davos, where the Chinese and the Russians come, is not really a mediating body. It's a deeply ideological outfit of the super rich, which tries to impose the ideas of the super rich on everybody else, and isn't frankly very open to dissident or different opinions.
What about China then? What's going on with China, and what's the future of China and therefore the world?
Well, China is, of course, the big rising power. In the last 40 years, 30 years, it's grown in power to an extraordinary degree. Its economy is now immense. I went to China for the first time in August 2017, and I was astonished by the scale of the Chinese economy. I mean, you know, it has to be seen to be believed. It's a country with huge problems. When it operates on that kind of scale, the problems are also similar in scale. I think a lot of the things that you read about China, about the fact that the debt build up there has been very dangerous, that there are major imbalances in the Chinese economy, I think they're all true. It's inevitable when a country has come so far, so fast, that huge imbalances appear. And the Chinese face an enormous challenge of managing those imbalances and at the same time also managing this new situation in which they find themselves, in which they are now the center of another geopolitical and economic pole to the long established one of the West. And a lot will depend on how well and successfully the Chinese manage this transition that they themselves have to work through. My impression of China, having been there, is that the people who run China are highly intelligent people, and that they're very well aware of these problems, and that they are capable of managing these things properly. There's always a risk of things going wrong. It would be a disaster, I would add, if they do, but I don't think they will. I think ultimately they will pull it through. But I will also say something else. China will be a giant, but I don't think that China has any aspiration to be a kind of hegemon that some people fear that it will be. And I certainly don't think that the Chinese think of themselves as spreading their ideology, such as it is, or their system, or their economic system around the world. I think that is a complete misunderstanding of Chinese society and of the kind of way the Chinese think. I think from their point of view, their concern at the moment is to manage their problems, manage their own success, and consolidate it so that, you know, they have a secure position for China going forward. I don't think they have an expansionist view of what they want to do, and I think this is a misconception.
What about the perception and conception of the church bell in Spain?
Oh.
What about the American corporations in China, and what is it that their perception of China and their future is? It seems like Apple's kind of made their plans.
Yes, well, we'll see. I am someone who believes that over the not very long term, the United States and China will go economically their separate ways, in the sense that they will trade with each other very much as two great economic blocs do. But the sense that we had a few years ago in Europe, there was even an expression, chimerica, that these two economies, the US economy and the Chinese economy, were becoming almost merged, and that the presence of US corporations in China and the scale of Chinese investments in America meant that there was almost a kind of convergence between the two. I don't think that's going to happen. But obviously, two such big economies, two such big trading economies, and China must trade. It's not self-sufficient in the way that the US, to a great extent, still is. They will continue to maintain their links, and we will still see, I think, American businesses in China and Chinese businesses in America. So there won't be a total severance. I think that is utopian, or if you like, dystopian. But I don't think we will see this chimerica, this convergence anymore. We will see separate blocks emerge. And in the nature of things, that's not something we should be, I think, unduly concerned about. It's part of history. It's how it works. The important thing is for these two great economic powers to continue to manage their relations so that even if they become adversarial, that adversarial relationship is held within certain bounds and doesn't spin out of control.
Well, so recently Apple and Facebook and Google moved a lot of their servers, so the data has been from American companies have been moved to most people's iCloud accounts, for instance, with their photos of their families and their GPS and everything. Is all are in businesses that are 51% owned by the Chinese government. Law. So I wondered, should we be concerned with that? And was Mr. Putin right in moving all of the corporate servers into mainland Russia, like VK? Is required to keep the servers watched, and we don't have that rule. Should we be concerned about our data?
Well, I think the country that has basically acted in a way that has encouraged more and more countries like Russia and China to start acting in this more nationalistic way, if you like, is the United States, which of course used its position. I suppose in some ways the temptation to do it was irresistible, but it used its position at the center of all these technologies, which of course it pioneered in order to try and influence political developments in other countries and for intelligence gathering. And I'm going to be absolutely straightforward about this. Where the Chinese are concerned, I think it beggars belief that the Chinese are not also using this their own technological prowess for some of the same things that the US has used its technologies for, in other words, for intelligence gathering and all the rest. And I think that more and more people in the United States are going to be concerned about the way the Chinese are present. And I think you will start to see a disassociation from the Chinese over time. The important thing, as I said, is not to say, that this is wrong or to deny that there are problems. It is to manage this thing in a careful and constructive way, to do it over time in a way that doesn't create more conflicts, which become more difficult to manage along the way. So not to arrest Chinese executives in Canada and deport them to the US and stop putting them on trial on mysterious and unspecified charges, which can only cause huge problems. Not to go around threatening people by saying, if you stop buying, technology from Huawei, you're going to, you're going to have all your intelligence from the US cut off. But gradually and systematically to broker deals with the Chinese, who are very pragmatic and practical people, say to them, look, this really can't play anymore. You're now a great power yourself. We can't assume that you're not going to use the position that you've achieved for the kind of advantages that we have used in the past. And let's see whether we can move constructively together to start to separate our different operating systems. I think the Chinese are fully up to that sort of thing. They are deeply pragmatic people, as I said, and they would do it. I think that it's not unreasonable to be concerned about these things. I don't think it's been done in a very clever way, but sooner or later, I think something will be sorted out.
Well, okay, so not outside of China then, but within the borders of the People's Republic, there are 52, speaking of the 52 ethnicities of non-Han Chinese, what's to become of them? What's to become of the Uyghurs? What's to become of the Tibet?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing to say, first of all, about China is, having been to China, it is overwhelmingly dominated by one ethnicity, which is the Han Chinese. And that Han Chinese ethnicity is determined to hold China together as it is. And I think that is a reality that must be faced both within China and outside it. I think that to imagine that the Uyghurs or the Tibetans or the other nations can somehow break away from this grip that the Chinese have over them is unreal and utopian. Now, within the Chinese constitution, and I mean, one has to be careful when one talks about the constitution in China, because China is a one-party state. We should not be unrealistic about that. But within the Chinese constitution, there are protections for these peoples. And I think the priority is for the Chinese themselves in their own interests, and for these nations within China in their own interests, to work out how to make these protections real, or more real than they currently are. But the reality has to be faced. This is a process which is going to happen within China itself. There is very little, in fact, I don't think there's anything usefully that outsiders can do about it. And the concern I have sometimes is that some of these campaigns that one sometimes sees about the Uyghurs or the Tibetans that you see happening in the West may raise unrealistic expectations, which could lead to people amongst these ethnicities doing things in the expectation of help, which simply will not come. I don't mean by that, by the way, that if the Chinese government does, appalling things, we shouldn't talk about it. But I think we should talk about it in a way that acknowledges the reality that it will be China that will decide the future of these peoples in the end. And that is a reality which we cannot change.
Do you think there's any fear then for the consequences then? I mean, there's Christians, I think, like the John Bush.
As I said, when I was in China, one of the things that really struck me actually was how many Christians there are in China. And it was striking also to see how carefully the Chinese government controls religious practice in China. It was also striking, by the way, to see to what an extent Chinese Christians seem to have accepted this reality. I think China will evolve and it will change in time. I think that there is a pessimistic view of China, which is now taking hold, possibly because we see China now as an adversary instead of a partner. And you see more and more articles appearing in more and more places which say that China has disappointed people because it hasn't become the democracy that we all expected that it would become. I think this is an over hasty and over pessimistic view. China may not be a Western style democracy. It is not a tyranny. As I said, I've experienced tyrannies. I've seen them for myself. It is an evolving thing. It will just have to change in its own way and in its own time. And I don't think there's anything we can do to affect or accelerate that process. And I think if we try, we could very well and very easily end up making it worse. But I think that if you compare the China of today with the China that existed 50 years ago, I mean, to deny that there is change and that it is change towards a more democratic and open society is to engage in denial. And I think that the Chinese, and I think this is a very wide perception across Chinese society, are very concerned about maintaining China's stability, which, given China's recent history, is not surprising. But I think, given time, they will get there. And the thing we need to do is to leave them alone to do it. I think they will do it themselves.
Well, okay, so it's then regarding outside of China's borders, or regarding beyond 50 years ago, 60 years ago China, like Taiwan, the nationalist state of China that was, removed from the UN board, right? The UN signed with several, like 5 starting nations. One Monday, the Taiwanese guy showed up and his chair was filled, and they're like, "Oh, you're not China anymore. Now
Yeah.
this is China." So, what about Taiwan, and what about the independent sovereignty? Is there any? Do they have the strength and capacity? I mean, obviously, they make most of the greatest technology, like supercapacitor phones, computers we're using for this probably use Taiwanese technology. But do they have the arsenal? Do they have the alliances necessary to defend themselves against being conquested by mainland China?
I think Taiwan is, to all intents and purposes, now a fully functional independent country. My own view is that it will remain so for at least the indefinite future, and for at least the foreseeable future. And I do not think that China will invade Taiwan. I think it would be a disaster for China if it did. And I think if it tried to invade Taiwan by force, I think it would find itself facing enormous problems. The Taiwanese can resist and would resist, in my opinion. That doesn't mean that Taiwan and China are not very close to each other. I mean, again, if you go to China, it's actually striking how Taiwanese pop music, for example, has penetrated quite widely in China. So, I mean, there will be close interaction. I think that Taiwan is an independent country to all intents and purposes. What the Chinese don't want, I think that fundamentally they understand that and they accept it. What I think the Chinese don't want is a open announcement by Taiwan that it is an independent country. I think for the Chinese government, and that would be an extreme national humiliation, and one that it would cause it enormous problems within China itself. And I think that is the primary concern. It's not, I think, to subordinate Taiwan to China, to make it, an actual part of China. It is to prevent the loss of face for China that would arise if Taiwan straightforwardly and openly said it is an independent country. Now, looking at this from the Taiwanese point of view, I understand why there are many people in Taiwan who, looking at China and looking at this colossus, say to themselves, well, is it really, do we really want to be in any way associated with this giant that's so nearby, and which has a system which is still a one-party system, when we in Taiwan have a distinct identity, and we're doing extremely well, and we are a flourishing economy and a strongly successful technological economy. And I can understand that and I can sympathize with it. But I think perhaps, again, it might be, and I'm not here to give them advice, but if I was asked to give them advice, I would perhaps say to them, well, I understand all of that, but is it ultimately something you want to do, to humiliate China by declaring yourselves independent in that way, and thereby create this conflict with an aggrieved and angry colossus which is on your doorstep, when the present arrangements are actually working very well for you? I mean, you have a very prosperous country. You're able to trade successfully with anybody you want, and you already have the United States at your back. So I would have thought that was an argument for keeping the status quo.
I love it. Well, okay, so now we're getting to some of the fun stuff. Who is Julian Assange? Who is Julian Assange, and why should everyone know his name?
Who is Julian Assange, and how is everybody? Why should everybody? I mean, I will say very straightforwardly, I think he is the best journalist around in the world now. I say that with great, humility. That's my opinion. But what Julian Assange did is that he has revolutionized investigative journalism, because what he does is he provides a vehicle for whistleblowers. And let's be absolutely clear, we need to have whistleblowers to know what's going on. I come back to the points I was making at the beginning of our program, of our discussion, that we need to have people, that the nation in a democracy must be kept properly informed of what is going on if it is to exercise democracy properly. That otherwise, you don't have democracy if things are being kept from the nation. What Julian Assange is doing is he is making it possible for the nation, for people like you and me, for all nations, if you like, to know what the power is up to. And he's doing it in a very interesting way, because what he does is he offers he offers whistleblowers a platform in which they can publish that information. So instead of having information from someone like, Chelsea Manning, mediated to us through the established media, as has classically happened, we just see the raw data now, and we can look at it and we can develop our own views. And given how compromised the media has become in the world, as we discussed earlier, I think that is absolutely an essential role. So that is, I think, what Julian Assange is doing, has been doing. And I think it's absolutely vital. And what makes him a great journalist is, as I say, he doesn't interpose his opinions. He doesn't mediate the information. He trusts us to form our own views. And that is a profoundly democratic thing. So that's why I called him the greatest journalist in the world today.
Well, so what did he do that ended up changing the opinions of the mainstream? I mean, there's so many people who read The New Yorker who thought he was just the greatest thing in the world, and now they don't. What did he do that changed the perception?
Well, he ousted them. It's what I said. Instead of providing the information to The New Yorker or to The Guardian or to wherever, and providing all this information to them in sort of so that they actually were the people who provided, who edited all this information and made it palatable so that we would only see it as they wanted us to see it. He cut them out in a sense. He actually went ahead and provided this information in its raw state so that people like you and me could actually see it. And I think that was something which the big media really didn't like. And if you read The Guardian, which is the newspaper which in Britain, where of course Julian Assange and WikiLeaks are based, at one time was working closest with him. What made them really sour on him was precisely the fact that he was doing this. He wasn't working through them. He was working to some extent with them, but he was always willing in the end to publish things by himself in an unmediated form. And they didn't like that at all, because that went to the root of how they see themselves as, if you like, the gatekeepers of what we are allowed to know and what we're allowed to see. So that was why they soured on him. Now, of course, I'm going to say something else, which is that, of course, the media, as we again discussed in our program, has come increasingly to see itself in the West as an instrument, if you like, of elite opinion. I know that's controversial, but that's how I see it. And that's why, as I said, people like us exist. And as Assange became increasingly subversive in what he was doing by exposing what the US government, which is the prop and center of, the Washington consensus and the elite, was doing, that also began to be extremely concerning to much of the media, who didn't really want people to know what was going on in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and what the NSA was up to. and how it was spying on everybody. And that also, I think, in the end, caused them to sour on him. So that's why we've seen this radical shift in perceptions of Assange over time. And of course, just to add quickly, I mean, the whole Russiagate affair has played another role again, because he's been blamed, I think very unfairly, by many people for Donald Trump and for the fact that Hillary Clinton lost the election. And I don't think that was his doing. I think that was Hillary Clinton and the Democrats doing. But there we are.
Utterly interesting. So is there a thing then besides Russiagate that you would say was part of the main, like one of them, what are some of the main pieces of information he put out that you think, like, what are like maybe two of the biggest things, Russiagate, and what's another that pivoted him and maybe had something to do with the fact that he's been, why would he be silenced and sequestered so harshly?
Yes.
Some information possibly that he really.
I mean, we've got to remember that, I mean, the pressures on him began before Russiagate. I mean, they really began with the Chelsea Manning in material, which he published. And the problem with that was that exposed the heart of what the US was doing. I mean, we had the diplomatic cables, which showed how US embassies were working, and how the US essentially was basically saw itself as not just another country, but rather as a sort of supervising country that was telling other countries how to run its affairs, and had an extraordinary conception of itself. And then we saw, again, as a result of the Manning revelations, all the things that were going on in wars like Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's important to say that the media in Britain had actively supported the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, there were one or two dissident voices, but very few. And of course, the governments of Britain, in Britain especially, had actively supported those wars. So that was what really began to sour them when they saw things like, videos of people being machine gunned by soldiers flying American helicopters, civilians being machine gunned. That was a shock. That was a profound shock, because of the way those wars and the debacle in Iraq especially had become a catalyst for people in Britain, which, as I said, has already got many tensions building up in Britain. But the war in Iraq was a catalyst for causing British people to challenge their own establishment. And that was, he was the messenger. Assange was the messenger of all these things. And that was when they first started to turn so heavily against him in Britain and elsewhere. I think that the role that WikiLeaks played in the Snowden allegations, this was after, of course, Assange had already come under immense legal pressure. But, the Snowden allegations, which showed the, massive surveillance that was going on, and the role that agencies like Britain's GCHQ was playing in it, that also, I think, hardened attitudes against Assange even further. So by the time Russiagate came along, realistically, the British political class was, and the political class of the West was already very hostile to him. But Russiagate was the last straw.
So how long was he able to last in the Ecuadorian embassy? Why was the Ecuadorian embassy the right place to go, and when did that no longer become advantageous?
Well, I'm not personally entirely convinced that it was the right place to go. I mean, he will say that he had no option but to go there. I mean, there are reports, which I can't confirm, that he was trying to get to, that WikiLeaks was looking at many embassies, and they're all turning him down, and that the embassy of Ecuador, the Ecuadorian government, actually reached out to him and offered him an opportunity to go there. But I've often wondered whether, despite the fact that I personally consider the Swedish allegations that were made against him completely unfounded, whether it might not have been in his interests actually to go to Sweden and confront the Swedes there and expose the falsity of those allegations, and then take the risk, if they deported him to the US, to fight his case there. So I've never been absolutely certain in my own mind that going to the Ecuadorian embassy was the right thing to do. But he did go. I can understand why he went, because it was quite obvious to me that the US was out to get him. And he held out in the embassy for as long as he did, because he had a president in Ecuador, Rafael Correa, who was backing him. But the moment Rafael Correa was no longer president, and the moment a new president came in, I think it was only a matter of time before he was thrown out. And I think Lenin Moreno, who was the president of Ecuador, was looking for a pretext to throw Assange to the wolves. And at the same time, I think he was using Assange as a bargaining tool with the US to extract a big IMF loan. So it was a pretty sordid story, but it was inevitable. It was after 2017, when the government in Ecuador changed. It was only a matter of time before Assange found himself in detention in a British prison.
So, I'm sorry, I just had to say it's very interesting thinking about Ecuador, because, I used to live in Ecuador, and they don't use, the currency they use is the dollar, the US dollar. Yeah. So it's interesting that you say that he was invited to a place that's kind of considered a de facto economic state of the United States by some. Yeah. And it's a good place in general. At the time, Moreno, though, wasn't in charge. So you're right, like, it changed everything about the South American alliance.
Yeah, I think partly, and I've never been to Ecuador, but I do wonder whether it was also partly Correa's way of showing that, despite the fact that Ecuador was so closely tied economically to the United States, the fact that it was inviting someone like Assange there was a way of asserting Ecuador's independence at the same time. People have a way of doing that kind of thing. It sort of might have been psychologically necessary to a reformist president, as Correa imagined himself to be.
Correa said crazier things on Twitter than I think Trump has ever been able to do accumulated. Well, it's impressive stuff. So, okay, so then what exactly happened recently to Assange, and why is he where's the transition end up,
Well, that's a very, very good question. I mean, I should say that I'm in peripheral contact with his legal team. One of his lawyers, Jennifer Robinson, is a personal friend. And she was even a lodger in my house for a while. That was some years ago. So I mean, I'm not, shall we say, objective about this, but I think that the extradition request that's come from the United States, which of course it was for a very long time denied would ever come, I think it's a very highly political extradition request. It's based on the Assange on the Manning revelations. I think if you unpack it carefully, it's clear that it's an attack on a journalist's rights under the First Amendment of the Constitution. I think the British authorities should reject it. I still have some faith in the British court system. I think that as you move up the court process, the court hierarchy, you find judges here who take their functions extremely seriously. And I'm not without hope that this extradition case will fail and that Assange will be allowed to stay in Britain. But the reality is that the British political elite is completely opposed to him. The security services are completely opposed to him. And certainly he also has his opponents in large sections of the British judicial hierarchy also. There have been some very bizarre and strange judgments against him, at least that's my opinion. And I think that despite my hopes, the odds are that he will eventually find his way to the United States before that court in West Virginia. And if he does go there, his chances, frankly, don't look good.
So it's interesting because there's been a lot of debate and candor on both sides of that argument. I'm very curious if you think there's any truth or any what is the plausibility, let's say, of there being a benefit to him going to the United States? Do you think that there is any truth to, I mean, there's the QAnon thing. Do you think there's any truth to any of this? That there's some work going on to try to help Assange, or?
He does have support in the United States and some very powerful institutions. I mean, I wouldn't count very much on the fact that some journalists have now come along and said, well, you know, this is an attack on the First Amendment rights, and for that reason we should go along with this. I mean, even Rachel Maddow apparently has said that. But I think overall, organizations like, say, the American Civil Liberties Union seem to have grudgingly come round to speaking out for Assange. And there is a huge depth of legal knowledge and understanding in the United States, and an understanding of the First Amendment rights and of the Constitution, which obviously we can't replicate here in Britain. So if he does go to the United States, and if he is able to fight a case there, well, it's possible, I think, that he might win, but I wouldn't, you know, if I was advising him, which I'm glad to say I'm not, I wouldn't recommend it. I mean, I think after seeing what's happened to people like Chelsea Manning, for example, who I understand is still in detention because she's refusing a grand jury order to give evidence against Assange, which I think is outrageous, by the way. I would not recommend that Assange goes to the US and takes his chances there. I would fight the extradition case here and hope for the best here. That's my own personal view, and that's certainly the view of his lawyers.
What's your perception on Trump's view of him?
I think Donald Trump is somebody who is not very interested in Assange, frankly, and isn't going to lift a finger to help him. I think he said some favorable things about Assange during the 2016 election. I don't think he really meant them very seriously then, and I think he's not going to do anything to help Assange now. And I think anybody who thinks he will is being, frankly, well, I think he's misguided, because, as I said, I don't think Donald Trump cares about Assange. I think Donald Trump is focused on one thing at the moment, which is getting re-elected in 2020. And I don't think he wants more trouble for himself by trying to help Assange.
Do you follow any of the QAnon things, and what do you think of all of it? And what is it in general?
I'm afraid I'm going to be straightforward here. I don't really, but that's I mean, you know, I do more geopolitical news and things of that kind. If you want to ask me specific questions about it, I mean, I'll try to answer them, but it's not perhaps my special strong suit.
It's just a phenomenon. It's always interesting to see what people think of it. I mean, in general, but I guess we can move on to the Epstein questions. Who and why is Epstein still important? What was the Lolita Express?
Well, that's a huge question, and you know, again, I think Americans are perhaps better placed to answer this sort of thing than I am. I'm going to say first of all that there are obviously pedophiles, but it seems that Epstein is one, and obviously that's a terrible thing. But I think what makes this particularly concerning is that Epstein seems to have been at the center of American power in some form. I mean, it's uncertain how rich he was, but he was obviously very rich. He was obviously able to move in very high social circles. He had all sorts of political friends and political contacts, and he was able to carry out his abuse, as far as I can see, almost in plain sight. And that does suggest that he had a great deal of political pull and a great deal of political protection, or at least in his own mind he did, and that he operated with some degree, as he thought, of impunity. And I'm not sure that's all true, but that's how it looks, at least from a British perspective. And I think that given that is so, there has to be worry that that might be true and that he really did have some kind of protection. And given the kind of people that he knew, and if he did have protection, the question is why and who was it who was protecting him? The Russians, by the way, have this wonderful word, which is called krisha. Krisha means, you know, protection, the kind of protection that somebody higher up the chain is able to extend to people lower down the chain. Did Epstein have krisha, and who was providing it? And was that making it possible for him to abuse more and more people, lots and lots of people who might otherwise have been protected and defended? And we'll just have to see. I think we're still at the beginning of this investigation, and we will no doubt find out. Now, as to what the Lolita Express was, well, I think everybody's heard by now about his private Boeing 727, which was taking all these important people like Prince Andrew of England and ex-President Bill Clinton, allegedly, and all sorts of other people to this island, Little St. James. And you can see on YouTube all the drone pictures of what this island looked like. And apparently it was full of suggestive pictures, and all kinds of orgies used to happen there. So when people talk about the Lolita Express, Lolita is, of course, a book, a novel by the Russian author Nabokov about a fascination for an underage girl by an academic. And of course it's come to be used as a euphemism for interest in underage girls, in other words, for paedophile interests. And that's presumably why it's called the Lolita Express, because that's what it appears to have been. It appears to have been a vehicle of a man who clearly was involved in underage sex, and perhaps the people who were boarding those planes and going to that island, at least some of them were aware of it and nonetheless went ahead and did it. And that begs the question why. And given who was using this plane and why, that of course also begs lots and lots of questions.
So yeah, I mean, you brought up also Prince Andrew, right? And so then there's Jimmy Savile. When you start thinking about the little black book with the Rothschild, the Rothschild, are these going to be the ways that we find? As you said, obviously there are pedophiles. Is this going to be how we start to find the network? You think is he maybe the thing that's tying them together?
Well, that may very well be, and I mean that's the concern. And I have to say, it's there are some pieces of what could be a jigsaw now out there, but we've got to wait and see, because there is an investigation underway and we must wait upon the results of that investigation. I hope we do have a proper investigation, and I hope we do have all answers to those questions. I've seen some claims that Epstein can hide behind this sweetheart deal he did with Jim Acosta, and that will protect him because of the double jeopardy protection. I hope that isn't true, and I hope we find out the truth, because obviously if there was a ring, we need to know about it, and we need to know who was involved.
Does the way the Jimmy Savile case posthumously was handled give you any hope, or or less than, based on the way?
Well, less hope, because of course the point about Jimmy Savile, and here again, it was somebody who was operating in plain sight. By the way, I mean, I know Jimmy. I didn't know Jimmy Savile. I know people who knew Jimmy Savile, and they're all telling. I mean, it was widely known that he was extremely weird and was up to all kinds of things. Nonetheless, nothing happened to him until after he was dead. It had to wait until he died for all the revelations about the things he was doing on a simply enormous scale to come out. And well, it wasn't just Jimmy Savile. There was a British MP called Cyril Smith. I'm talking about Britain because obviously it's the country I know. Again, it was widely known apparently throughout political circles that Cyril Smith was a aggressive paedophile, engaging in all kinds of grotesque abuse. And again, the fact was covered up until after his death, when it finally became publicly known. And one does wonder what kind of reason there was for keeping things like that secret. And I do hope that nothing like that's going to happen with Epstein. But obviously, the fact that it happened with people like Smith and Savile does make me worry that something like that might happen with Epstein. I don't think so, because too much is out in public now, and I would have thought that there would be too much pressure, too much knowledge now has come out already into the open for there to be that kind of cover-up. But we see the cover-ups happen, and perhaps it will again. I hope not.
Simultaneously to this is the NXIVM cases going on with the human trafficking and the pyramid scheme where they're taking kids and young women and they're training them to be basically like sex agents. Is there some, looking at both of them, do you think that there's some sort of, is that trend a thing? And what is NXIVM something that's happening in Britain, or is it mostly America?
Oh, I think so. I think it's definitely been happening in Britain, and I think it's been happening on a very, very considerable scale. I'm going to give you a personal anecdote now. I used to be long ago, well, not so long ago, I used to belong to a very established, old-fashioned club in London, a sort of the kind of club that Britain has, the sort of thing that Phileas Fogg and people like that used to belong to. And then I remember once turning up at a Christmas party and being astonished to see suddenly that all those people there suddenly had girlfriends, the oldest of whom looked like she was 17 or something like that. And I immediately terminated my membership. But I've heard that lots of things like that are now happening. And it was very surprising how suddenly it all seemed to change. Now, I don't know how that came about or why it happened, but it did seem to be linked, at least in Britain, to the collapse of the Soviet bloc, the old Soviet bloc, and the sudden availability of lots of girls that were coming out of there. And, that suddenly seemed to change things radically in Britain. And I wonder whether it didn't set in train all kinds of other terrible things that have followed in their wake and are still continuing. We'll see. But certainly all sorts of things like this happen in Britain, of that there's no doubt.
So, in other words, there's some sort of an syndication or organization to it, and maybe alliances of it. Epstein had a $100 million bail. He says he's willing to pay. He's got all this money. Is there evidence that it's all just his money, or does that end up meaning that he's part of something bigger?
I have to say that, I don't know, but there seems to be great uncertainty about how Epstein became as rich as he did. And he's also involved, or appears to be involved, and if you're talking about the British connection, with this woman, Ghislaine Maxwell, who is the daughter of Robert Maxwell, who was this extraordinary businessman with a very flamboyant and mysterious past, who died in a very strange way in 1991. And shortly after, it was exposed that he'd stolen vast sums of money from his company's pension funds. And it did make me wonder whether perhaps Epstein was acting as a caretaker for the money of various people, including possibly some Maxwell money, but perhaps other people too. And that might explain it. And that might also explain why it wasn't just providing a caretaker service, but he might have been providing other services also. But again, I hope that we do find out the truth to these things, because there are mysteries. I'm going to make a guess, by the way, about Epstein, which is that obviously we think of Epstein as an American scandal, but two important British people, Prince Andrew and Ghislaine Maxwell, have also been identified as being involved. I suspect that there are a lot of British threads to this story, and that we're going to find them out eventually. And we shall see. As I said, lots of seats, lots of things, lots of pieces of what look like a jigsaw, but we haven't yet been able to put them together because we don't yet have the information to. But some of those pieces look like they're British.
So looking into like the meta trafficking then of these images that were related to, we had Pizzagate, basically this idea of Twittergate, these children with hashtags or women being traded with hashtags. We're now seeing hundreds of examples of those around the world.
Yes.
What does that mean for the how pushing aside what isn't? What's the truth then about these kinds of things, about the meta trafficking?
Well, I'm going to say something about this, which comes back to what we were saying about earlier in the program about the separation between nations and states, and how elites seem to have become disconnected from their people. And I can't help but think that what has happened to some extent is because of the erosion of democracy. Elites have become increasingly unaccountable and have developed a sense of impunity. And that has led some members of these elites to feel that they can get away with anything. And that this has led in a deeply troubling way towards these sort of activities. I mean, coming back to that incident in the club, which I mentioned, which, as I said, I found deeply shocking and very horrifying. One of the things that made me very disturbed about it was, as I said, it came that came at a time when things in Eastern Europe seemed to be falling apart, and it seemed almost as if these were trophies. These girls were trophies that these people were picking up, and that in itself was really disturbing. And it did make me wonder at the time. I remember thinking at the time, what is happening to our society? How is it happening that these sort of standards, which we all used to follow, are breaking down in the way that they are? And whether, these really terrible sort of attitudes are now finding free rein in a way that never used to be true before. So I suspect that we're going to find that there's an awful lot more of this going on that we are aware of, and that Epstein just is the surface of it, and just a tiny thing on the surface.
Yeah, do you think that maybe, since 2008, I think this is part in, that we're looking back at, usually when a piece in the game gets that hot, they take it out to let it cool off for a while. Do you think
Yes.
maybe it's been far enough in that there's an entire new system, where the system itself has replaced him with other things, and this is just a show to keep, while the one hand of the magician's empty, the other hand is in use under the table?
Yeah, well, I'm afraid so. I mean, it could very well be that Epstein, especially as I said, if he was acting as in a caretaker role, is now just expendable. So this is the moment to throw him to the wolves, even as we've made up our arrangements with other things, and we can come along and say, well, look, we've locked up Epstein, and that shows how we've cleaned things up, and there isn't anything more to worry about. And in reality, all the same things go on as before, and have even got worse. I hope that isn't so. I would not be surprised if it was. At this moment in time, we simply don't know. We will see. We will have to wait and see how this investigation develops.
So who's the next Epstein, and what will we see? Will we see Podesta's in the limelight again soon, maybe, or is that?
Your guess is as good as mine. I'm sure I'm not in a position. I mean, I don't know. I don't know who the next Epstein is. All I know is there is one. There's bound to be one. As I said, that is the one certainty. I can't name any specific person, but I'm sure that such a person exists, and more than such a person, lots of people like that exist.
So do you think then, does it look like maybe that we're seeing a legitimate effort to clean up the world's problem, or does this look like it's another show?
No, I don't think we are in anywhere close to seeing a legitimate effort or genuine effort to clean up the world's problems. I mean, it could be that Epstein did something that was so outrageous that, people just couldn't ignore it, or it could be, and I know this is a theory some people have expressed, that this was an attempt to get a Donald Trump through Epstein because Jim Acosta was the person who did the sweetheart deal with him and was in Donald Trump's administration, and the Donald Trump and Epstein have been caught on some videos together. It could be that, or it could be, looking at it from another point of view, there is people in the FBI hugely embarrassed by the way Russiagate has gone, who are trying to get back some credit by going after Epstein and doing something like that. Or it could be that there is some other vast scandal out there and somebody wants to divert attention away from that vast scandal by raking up the old Epstein one all over again. There could be any number of reasons. But I mean, the reality is, if we wait for the powers above us to clean things up for us, then we're going to be waiting forever. This isn't the start of that. I mean, no way is it the start of that.
Are there some characters that the United States citizens, more broadly in the world stage, should be aware of around the president? Because I don't think everyone knows everybody.
Well, again, I look at foreign policy mainly. I mean, I'm seriously concerned about the role of people like Bolton and Pompeo, who are running US foreign policy at the moment. I mean, Bolton seems to me to be somebody who, in a completely misguided belief in American power, is prepared to go to war with practically everybody and all the time. And Pompeo has certain religious views, which I think predispose him also to take a very aggressive line. But as a general principle, it seems to me that the major criticism I would make of Donald Trump's administration is that even though Donald Trump sets himself out to be an anti-elitist president, the people who you see in his administration, people like Mnuchin and Wilbur Ross and all the rest, are pure elite. I mean, they are absolutely part of the system that we are talking about, and that it isn't realistic to expect them to carry out any deep reforms. And on the contrary, it seems to me that what they're doing is reinforcing the system that we have now. So I wouldn't specify any specific person there. I mean, I just don't know enough about the administration to be able to do that. But it certainly doesn't look to me to be a radically different administration from the ones we've had in the past.
So does it look to you like there's any truth to this concept of the outside of the United States, former discrete deep state? Is there a discrete state? Does that exist?
Yes, I think it does. And I think, again, we have to be realistic about this. I think if we're looking at all great powers, by the way, the United States is not exceptional in this. There is a bureaucracy. There is always in all these states a full-time national security bureaucracy, which has existed for a long time, and which will defend its privileges and will defend its policies, and which will be extremely resistant to any political pressures, and which has huge tools it can use in order to try to bend the political process to its will. Always there is a deep state. There is a deep state in the United States. There's a deep state in Britain. There's a deep state in France, in Germany, in Italy, in Russia. Unquestionably, there is one in Russia. The thing we need to always know is that there is such a thing. We mustn't delude ourselves about its existence, and we must never fall into the error of thinking that bureaucracies are these impartial and objective things which we can, made up of these, public-minded, unselfish, apolitical functionaries who will loyally do whatever the political leaders that we elect ask them to do. I mean, we must never fall into the error of thinking in that way. Always we must understand that these people are there, and we must push back against them because they will push back against us.
Have you heard about Andrew Yang? And what do you?
Yeah, I've heard of Andrew Yang.
Do you have any thoughts about him? He's kind of like a Tory crossed with Neo from The Matrix. I was wondering.
He is a most extraordinary man. I have to say that his ideas about automation, I find, frankly, both simultaneously an alarmist and a bit utopian. And I also think that also his ideas, for minimum wages and all this sort of thing, are equally utopian, to be honest, and alarmist. That's not to say he's not interesting. I mean, he's obviously somebody, that one likes to have around. But I would say that he's more someone that I would call a almost borderline science fiction person, rather than a serious politician. And I'm not surprised that he's not making a political impact, but I'm not sorry to see that people like him are around, and I keep an eye on what people like him say.
Well, I wish more people that worked at the McDonald's and the supermarkets that have the robot checkout stands would look.
Yes.
I think there's definitely a demographic for him there. What is one thing or something that you don't really get to talk about much that you wish you did more often?
Well, I would love to talk a lot more about cultural matters. Very little opportunity to, but I think we don't talk enough about culture and art, and which is an important thing. I think we become so concerned now about economics and technology that I think we lose sight of the sort of that sort of dimension. And I remember how before, people like Andrei Sakharov, the Russian scientist, for example, or Amartya Sen, the Indian economist, they used to say, that having an understanding of philosophy, of culture, of art, of literature is extremely important for people who are interested in science and technology or economics or whatever, in order to keep a balance and to keep a proper ethical feeling. But much as I like to talk about these things, the opportunity to do so is small. And it's something, as I said, that especially as my wife is a person who is a literary critic, it's not enough I do. There's not enough opportunity to do it, and I think it's necessary, but it gets crowded out by other things.
Yeah, literally that's what just happened. It's amazing. Usually what we do on this show is more about culture and history, particularly in the Tartarian lost Tartar history.
That's one of the reasons I'm so delighted to be speaking here.
That's fantastic. I don't know if there's much you have. Obviously we've been on for a while, so at any point that you feel like you're exhausted and we're done, that's fine, because I answered all my questions, really.
Oh, well.
That you wanted to talk about ancient history. This is
Well, I mean, if I may very quickly say, I mean, you were asking me earlier about, how I became interested in these things. And I mentioned that I'm Greek, but I mean, I did a lot of ancient Greek history. And I mean, one of the people I, of course, read was Thucydides. And a lot of my understanding of international relations originates with Thucydides. And one book in particular has had great influence on me. I'm not the only one, but I mean, just mention it, is a book by a historian called Geoffrey de Saint-Croix, complicated name, but if you read it, you can find it on Amazon. It's called The Origins of the Peloponnesian War. And de Saint-Croix is interesting because he was like me. He was a lawyer who then went to history. I did the opposite. I was a historian who then, for a period, became a lawyer. But we have very similar sort of mindsets. And he took this book of Thucydides and he gave this very realist, analytical interpretation of it, which I think has given me great insight into thinking about international politics to this day. And I mean, I would certainly recommend that book to anybody who wanted to understand politics and international affairs. And of course, history is obviously something I read extensively. Chinese history, by the way, the history of the imperial dynasties was something I've also took a huge interest in. And we could talk about that because, of course, that also is a different cultural mindset, and a different way of organizing government and international affairs from the one that we are used to in the West, because the Chinese had a concept of international relations which was based much more on concepts of ethics and culture than on power dynamics. And of course, they weren't able to always to follow it very closely, but it had more of an impact on the way they tried to pursue international relations than we ever understood. And again, there are books on China. Cambridge Ancient History is one, but the United States especially has a lot of good books on this. And one of the most interesting books that I read recently was one on on a religious controversy, or rather not a religion, a controversy about ritual that took place in 16th century China, which again explained a great deal about power relations and culture in that very different society from ours.
So I can't help but ask then, since I forgot how Greek you might be. So what do you think about Thracian history and like the pre-Greco Thracian Empire?
Oh, the Thracians. Well, I don't know. I mean, Bulgaria is, of course, where the Thracians were. I know it very well, and I've been there. Thracians are a remarkable people, whom people in the West know far too little of, and who were undoubtedly hugely influential in this part of the world. The Thracians, the Illyrians, all of these different nations. And we mustn't think of Greece, of ancient Greece, as a distinct society. It interacted lots with these other cultures. It took things from them, it gave things to them. And if you look at the Macedonian state, that was heavily influenced by its interactions with these different cultures also.
So, okay, so then the hypothesis has been this idea that there is a prehistoric confederation of alliances between different states that were spread across the world. How plausible do you think this is, that there was communication between the Western Hemisphere and Eurasia?
No question there was. Absolutely. Of course there was. I mean, I'll give you an example. You could see this in archaeology because, again, I should say, I mean, I was very interested in archaeology. And because my aunt was Minister of Culture in Greece, I was often the person who was able to turn up at archaeological sites when things were discovered. But I mean, one of the most striking things about archaeology is you see how objects from extraordinary far-flung places used to turn up very unexpectedly in archaeological sites in Greece. And one of the most interesting for me is watching the movements of stones like lapis lazuli. Lapis lazuli is mined in Afghanistan, but it was used heavily in jewelry in Greece. Now that means contact. That has to mean a contact between these different cultures. Or you could see it in a different way, which is in Greek philosophy. It's only very recently that we've begun to understand, for example, how much of Greek philosophy and how much of Indian philosophy around the same period, how obviously they clearly interacted with each other. So movements between different populations and ideas, movements of ideas, happen to a far greater extent than we have ever, than, if you like, orthodox history recognizes. And clearly there was much more diffusion than we know of today.
This has been one of my favorite interviews. I really appreciate that you made the time to do this.
Well, it's been a huge pleasure. It's been a huge pleasure.
I do hope that in the future, if you're able to come back, I would love to have you back and we can talk more about history and politics. It sounds like you're interested in it and you know a lot.
Absolutely. 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 I would love to. I would absolutely love to. Let's do that. Let's definitely do that.
Absolutely. Excellent. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Check out the Duran. The Duran's my favorite publication. I hope it becomes yours too.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Bye.